And with me right now is Mr. Mike Williams. How's it going, Mike?
It's going very well, Michael. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you're here. There's so much to discuss with you here. Too much to discuss with you, my friend. And I want to thank you for your time. And for those who don't know, Mike is a musician and independent researcher renowned for his in-depth interviews and investigations into the hidden history of the Beatles, especially the controversial Paul is Dead narrative. And from my recollection, Mike, I believe you started way back in, what was it, 2016, correct?
It was 2016, Michael. Up to that point, I knew about the Paul is Dead conspiracy, but I didn't give it any weight. I just thought it was a marketing gimmick by the Beatles to engage with their
Yeah.
fans. So I was a diehard Beatle fan, Beatle freak. And in 2016, I read the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears. The book actually came out in 2009, so I got to it in 2016. I was 7 years late to the party. I found it on a lark on Amazon. I started reading it, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. But I stuck with it, and what I looked to do was to check out what the book was saying. So the book would present certain statements in the narrative, and I would go research it. And fully thinking initially that I was going to debunk the stuff that I was finding in the book, but that didn't happen. As I researched, I found that the book was actually quite accurate and truthful.
So you got deeper into it, actually, in other words.
Yeah, I got deep into it. What happened initially was I got the book, I read it, and Sophia Smallstorm is a friend of mine, and at the time Sophia was doing podcasts, and I said to her, hey, I'm reading this book. It's a really crazy book. And I told her it's about the Paul is Dead conspiracy. And I was telling her a little bit about what the book was saying. So she said to me, Mike, why don't you come on my show and talk about the book? I didn't want to do it, Michael. And the reason why I didn't want to do it, first of all, I didn't think it was going to be that big a deal, to be honest with you. And the other thing was I had to put together a massive presentation in order to be able to step the audience through the narrative. The book is 666 pages. There's 66 chapters. And my initial thought was, how am I going to boil this down and then present it within 2 hours, within a 2-hour time frame? Eventually, what happened after I dragged my feet, hoping Sophia would forget, but she doesn't usually forget things, I ended up doing the show with her in September of 2016. And I honestly thought it was going to be the only show I was going to do on the topic. And then in November of 2016, Mark Devlin, who is also a friend, he said, hey, Mike, I heard your show with Sophia. Why don't you come on my show and talk about this? And I said, okay, Mark being a friend and all. So I did it. And during that show, I said to Mark, this is going to be the last show that I'm going to do on this topic because I just didn't want to be the Paul is Dead guy. And I just didn't think, Michael, that the whole thing was going to get legs beyond what I was taking the audience through with regard to the book. So long story short, I was terribly wrong. And I stuck with it. I kept going. I kept looking. It was like an addiction, trying to figure out all the little pieces of the puzzle and to try to connect the dots. And so I did it for 8 years. And I retired it back in November of 2024. And the reason why I ended the research, the ongoing research, the day in and day out stuff, was because after 8 years, I felt, look, I did as much as I could possibly do on this. I took it full circle. I connected a lot of dots. And I just didn't want to get into a position where I'm talking about it for the sake of talking about it.
Right. I imagine you got burnt out, basically.
Oh, yeah. What happens is new people are coming on board. They're going to the channel. And they're asking the basic questions. So what winds up happening is you're reiterating and regurgitating stuff that you've already talked about, stuff you've already presented, which is fine. I can completely understand that. But from a personal perspective, you get to the point where you think to yourself, okay, now it's diminishing returns, right?
Yes.
So, and then I made the decision. I said, look, the channel is out there. It's always going to be out there. I'm not taking it down. It's going to contain my body of work. And if people want to have their questions answered, what they'll have to wind up doing is hitting the other videos that have the answers to their questions. I'm not going to be able to answer everybody's questions. Some people would send me emails with, could you answer me the following questions? And they would list like 10 to 12 things that they wanted me to answer. And I thought, well,
Right.
I can't be doing this all the time. This is occupying too much of my time. And the other thing too with it is that I have a life. I have my wife, I have two grandchildren, and my wife and I are retired. And, we have a lot of stuff that we do. And the research was occupying a tremendous
Yeah.
amount of time.
I would imagine it's very time consuming. And so you put this in the grave, essentially, the proverbial grave. And I'm thinking maybe one day you release a book, perhaps.
People have asked me that. They said, Mike, are you going to write a book? I said, well,
Just to finally put it to bed. Just one book, just leave it all out there. You're done with it. Will that ever happen, Mike?
probably not.
Probably not. Okay.
Yeah, the reason why, Michael, is I have been asked that many, many times. And I said, the thought of it is enticing, but the amount of work that I would have to devote to putting that book together, it's just too much. At this point in time in my life, and with everything else I've got going on, it's just not something that's on my radar. It's funny, Vince Russo asked me the same question. So Vince said, Mike, are you going to write a book? And I told him the same thing I said to you. And Vince has written
Yeah.
books. So I said to him, Vince, you know how much work it takes to write a book. If I sat down right now and started writing down everything that I have researched over the past 8 years, that book will be out a decade from now.
That's true. No, you're right.
And I just don't want to bog my life down with that, Michael.
Yeah, more than you already have. You already spent years
Yeah.
covering this. And I appreciate that. And I admire your honesty and appreciate that sort of thing. And much respect to Vince Russo out there as well for asking these sort of things, trying to put that idea in your head. But it seems like a lot of other people have already tried.
Yeah, I've been asked many times. People will ask me in the comments section. They will write me emails and ask me if I'm going to write a book. So folks, really, I don't have any intentions of doing that. Like I said, it's
It
not
ain't
on my
happening.
radar.
It ain't happening.
Yeah, it's probably not going to happen. Yeah.
I don't blame you. I don't blame you. It is very time consuming. I've spoken to many people, interviewed a lot of people that author all sorts of material out there, and yes, it takes way too much time, and life is short.
Yeah, and when you do a book like this, you have to have all your citations, which I have, but it's very, very time consuming.
Right. And Mike, I gotta ask you this question. All this time you're putting all this material out there, you're this hardcore fan. Has this diminished sort of the charm of the Beatles that you once had? Has it damaged you in that sense regarding or in regards of you like being a fan, quote unquote fan of the Beatles? Has it hindered you at all?
Well, there was a reality check, Michael.
There we go. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, so I remember bugging my parents to go see Yellow Submarine in 1968. I was 9 years old.
Oh my.
So I was a little Beatle freak at 9 years old.
Damn.
And
Okay.
my father took us to the theater, me and my brother. My brother's 14 months younger than I am. And since that time, I wanted to learn to play guitar. I wanted to play Beatles songs on guitar. Seriously, I was like up to my eyeballs with the Beatles. But since the research, the luster, it's completely gone because they were not supernatural. They were not magical. They were four guys that were involved in a psychological operation, a major social engineering initiative that came out of Tavistock, which links back to the Frankfurt School. So once you get that shot of reality and you realize that this is manufactured, this is engineered, like everything else in this reality. It's not real. It's an illusion. I call the Beatles story, the official narrative, it's a fairy tale for adults. That's really what it is. It's no different than a kid believing that a 300-pound guy in a red suit and a white beard can shimmy down a chimney.
Right.
So that's where I'm at with it. Now, I get asked often, well, do you still listen to Beatle music? And I said, yeah, I have a big vinyl collection, and I will still put a Beatles album on once in a while and take a listen. And I can appreciate the craftsmanship of the music. I can appreciate the production of the music. regardless of who wrote it and who recorded it. But like I said, the whole luster, the whole magical piece about what I used to believe about the Beatles is completely gone.
It's tainted.
Oh, very much so. Yeah,
Tainted meat, as they say, yes.
yeah, yeah.
Oh man, I knew you would say that, by the way. I just had a feeling. I've never, well, I've heard a few interviews with you, but I don't think I remember hearing you talk about it that way in this sort of detail.
Well, I get asked once in a while, and what I usually respond with is the luster is completely gone. And so now I'm listening to it as an appreciator of, as I mentioned
Music.
before, yeah, the music, the craftsmanship, the production. When you put Abbey Road on as an example, it's a brilliantly produced album, and the songs are excellent. So I can sit down and listen to that and say, you know what? That's good stuff. But you have to listen to it once you know what I know, listen to it through a different lens and understand that the music had an agenda. Right? That's what the music was all about. It was pushing an agenda. And so once you understand that, then you don't go anywhere with the music other than listen to it.
Right.
You don't join the cult. I was in the cult.
You were in the cult. You drank the Kool-Aid, and it seems like that's a narrative that is very much alive to this day, and it applies to all sorts of different avenues and crooks and crannies, as they say.
Everything. Everything's a cult. Who you worship as a politician is a cult. Your favorite band's a cult. We're surrounded by entertainers and celebrities and all of this stuff, all of this pop music stuff. People jump into buckets and they're part of a cult. They have a certain belief system. They worship, they idolize. It's all around us. It's not just the Beatles. It's not just music.
It's everything really all around us, and you have these different branches of government that get involved. A good example would be like Charles Manson, basically.
Right.
Who's also, in my opinion, linked to the feds as well.
Yeah, there's people have made some connections going back to Laurel Canyon.
That's right.
And stuff like that, yeah.
Hey, you know what, Mike, gotta be honest. If the Beach Boys would have just listened and played more of his songs, I think Charles Manson might have still be alive today and wouldn't have killed all those people.
Yeah, well then it's the
that
argument.
Really sent him down. That really sent him down the downward spiral there.
Yeah, well then you have the argument that Charles Manson was pretty much a patsy, that there was a whole machine behind him and he was just the veneer. So who knows? I haven't spent a lot of time deep diving into Charles Manson. There's so many different takes, Michael, on different aspects of conspiracy.
Yeah.
You can ask 10 people something about a particular conspiracy and you'll get back 10 different answers.
True. But yeah, you appreciate the music when you listen to it now, in other words. And I know in our first conversation we had together, I brought up Quincy Jones, and he called the Beatles the worst musicians in the world.
Yeah, he called them no-playing MFers.
That's right. That too. When you listen to this, do you ever think, well, I wonder who exactly played guitar and played all this music, who really arranged it? Obviously the record labels, but in terms of musicians, we don't exactly know, do we?
Well, I have an idea.
You have an idea? Okay.
I do. Yeah, I do. The way it was structured, and this is based upon all the research I did into the Rubber Soul album, because the Rubber Soul album is the silver bullet that, in my mind, proves that the Beatles did not write all their own music and they did not play on all of their recorded tracks. If we go to the 1962 through 1966 period, that would be their first album, Please Please Me, through Revolver, and their UK albums. This is for the audience. Those are the Beatles' official album releases. It's not the capital US releases. Just a little point to make there. Between 1962 and 1966, Please Please Me through Revolver, I don't believe they wrote anything. And I don't believe that they played on any of those recordings. And that changed somewhat, starting with the release of Sgt. Pepper through 1970. And I'll get into this in more detail. That's because there was a changing of the guard, if you will, as to who was handling and managing the Beatles. So back during the 62 through 66 period, you had George Martin, who was referred to as the fifth Beatle. And I believe that George was their de facto handler. And when I say handler, I mean he was steering direction. He was making decisions about what songs are going to go on what album and how the Beatles as an entity were going to proceed along the timeline in order to move the social engineering agenda forward. Now, the social engineering agenda, when I talk about that, what I mean is the Beatles were created by Tavistock with linkages back to the Frankfurt School
Yeah.
for the purposes of, and I'm going to be very topical on this, maybe we'll get into it in more detail if we have time, but the main premise, mission of the Beatles was to transform the country away from traditional values and traditional religious institutions like Christianity and move it more toward a free love, drug culture, changing essentially the landscape of lifestyles, ethics, morals, those types of things. And the Beatles
Right.
were very successful in doing that. And that is all part of a Marxist strategy. I mentioned it goes back to the Frankfurt School, and that was done in order to implement cultural Marxism within Western societies. And the United States was a big, big prize for them. Big prize. So anyway, I don't want to get too deep into this right now because I'll derail, but because I want to get back to the musicians, and we could
Right.
talk more about
The
Frankfurt.
sexual revolution and that sort of thing.
Yeah, sexual revolution, drugs, all of that stuff. So as far as musicians go, so what I had concluded was that the way the system worked, or the way the process worked with the Beatles, like many, many, many other bands
Right.
during that time period, and in fact it still operates this way today, is that the songs were pre-written by ghostwriters. Now when I say ghostwriters,
Ghostwriters. Yeah.
so when I say ghostwriters, what I mean is I believe there was a small group, maybe a half dozen songwriters that came in under George Martin. And George Martin, I believe, was reporting up to Theodore Adorno, who was with the Frankfurt School. And I have concluded that it's likely that Theodore Adorno wrote some of the Beatles' music. He was a composer. George Martin, I believe, also wrote some of the Beatles' music. Now, there's a narrative out there, and it comes from Dr. John Coleman's book on the Committee of 300, which was released in the early part of the 1990s. I think it was around 1992. And in that book, Coleman had said that Theodore Adorno wrote all of the Beatles' music. And again, Adorno was tied back to the Frankfurt School, but the Frankfurt School and Tavistock are connected at the hip. For one guy to write all of that music, I thought to myself, I don't know about that. When I did my big presentation back in April of 2020, which is titled, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music?, I dove into Theodore Adorno. And with everything else that Adorno had going on with the Frankfurt School, his books, his interviews, I didn't think it was possible. It didn't seem reasonable to me that he would be sitting down writing all of their original compositions. Now,
Right. I had a hard time as well. I'm sorry to interrupt you like this, but I always have a hard time believing that artists themselves wrote a lot of this music. Lennon, McCarthy, they claim that they primarily wrote all the songs. And I've always thought, are you sure about that? I've always been extremely curious and skeptical about that part, especially nowadays. All these artists that people like, it's like none of them even wrote their own music.
And when their names do wind up on the credits, now it's possible, obviously, we're not going to discount that some artists can write their own music. But also what goes on in the music industry is if somebody contributes a couple of lyrics or maybe makes a suggestion or a recommendation on a couple of chords, they could end up getting song credit for writing that song. Now, did they really write the song? No, they didn't really write the song. And with artists, the reason why that's done, it's to promote them. It's to build them up, to make them look like they're these great songwriters, musicians, and so on. So it's kind of a pumping up of the tires approach to get the public to become more engaged and more in awe of these artists and these bands.
Yeah.
Right. So I think what happened was Adorno was the primary major stakeholder in the Beatles project, and I'll call it a project. It was a psychological operation. Underneath him was George Martin, who I refer to as the managing director of the project. So George was responsible for all of the operational stuff that was going on, making sure the songs got written, making sure the songs got recorded, getting the Beatles in the studio to sing the vocals. and I believe George was also writing some of the tunes. But underneath George Martin, I think there were maybe a half a dozen songwriters, like I mentioned before, that were on the Tavistock/EMI staff that
Hmm.
were
Yeah,
dedicated to writing the Beatles music. So you might have 2 or 3 songwriters that were focused on Paul McCartney style songs. Another 2 or 3 that were responsible for writing John Lennon style songs. So that's how the songs got written. And once the songs were written, George Martin would bring in the studio musicians, because that's what he worked with. He worked with studio musicians. And you would put the sheet music down in front of the studio musicians in the studio, and you would click the record button, and these guys and gals would go to town, and
that's right.
they would bang out these songs. Now, who are some of these musicians? So let me just take you through a couple. You may not know some of the names, but I'm sure the folks listening to the show, especially if they're around my age, will, because some of these names will ring a bell. The official narrative admits that Andy White played on 2 of the Beatles' songs going back to 1962. I think it was P.S. I Love You and Love Me Do. And George Martin had hired him to play drums. So Ringo, when they released the singles back in 1962, Ringo wasn't on those tracks. That was Andy White. And the official narrative admits that. Now, I don't believe that George Martin hired Andy White just to play on 2 songs. I think Andy White was hired to play on, in all likelihood, I would say it's likely that he played on many of the songs on their first album out of the UK, Please Please Me. So we have Andy White. So if we fast forward to 1978, Bernard Purdie. Bernard is, he's an American. He is considered one of the premier studio musicians. He's in the Drummers Hall of Fame. In 1978, in an interview, I think it was Gig magazine, he said that he drummed on 21 Beatles songs on the early albums.
That's correct. Yes. I'm
Okay.
familiar with them. Yes.
Okay. And of course, when he was being interviewed, the interviewer was saying, well, what songs? And Bernard said, well, I'm not going to tell you what songs. And the reason why Bernard didn't do that was because he was looking for more money from the Beatles enterprise.
Hmm.
And if he just spilled the beans about what songs, he felt that he was taking leverage away from himself. So that's why he never came out with the songs. Because people will ask me, well, they'll say, Bernard never named the song, so he's lying. He's lying. He's not lying. I mean, look at the guy's resume. He was Aretha Franklin's drummer for 25 years. He's played with Steely Dan. He's played with the Rolling Stones. I mean, the list of people that he's played for on recordings goes
Yeah, he doesn't
on
have
and
to
on.
lie.
No, he doesn't have to lie, right?
Yeah, he doesn't got to. No.
So anyway, so Bernard Purdie drummed on 21 early Beatles songs. Now, when he says the early albums, he's referring to Please Please Me, With the Beatles, and A Hard Day's Night. I think in one interview he mentioned the first 3 albums. And the way it was done was the tapes were sent to him over in New York, and he actually did the drum tracks in, at the time, Capitol had a studio, that recording studio. It's not there anymore. It's long gone. But back in the day, that's where he did the overdubs. He also took us all through it in an interview in 2004. It was a Red Bull interview, and he explained exactly how it worked and why it works that way. It's called fixing a record. And he said it goes on all the time. And he said, look, I was just doing a job. I was asked to come in and fix the drumming on these songs, put down a good drum track. And that's what he did. So we have Andy White and Bernard Purdie. Then I was contacted back after April of 2020, when I released my big presentation on whether they wrote all their music, by a relative of the great session drummer out of the UK, Ronnie Verrill. Now, Ronnie's been dead a long time, but his relative told me that Ronnie drummed on Beatles songs as well. And what she said to me was, Mike, now that the cat is out of the bag, let me just tell you, Ronnie drummed on Beatles songs as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then is something else that's very interesting. In an interview that goes back to 1976, the interviewer was a guy by the name of Roy Carr, C-A-R-R. And Roy later on became the editor of New Music Express, which is a music industry magazine. I don't know if it's still around anymore. It was big in its day. And he was interviewing Phil Spector. Phil, of course, was considered to be a brilliant producer. Crazy? Absolutely. But he was a brilliant producer. So in 1976, Roy Carr's having this interview with him, and Roy starts asking him questions, and Phil Spector says that he had been working with the Beatles since inception. So Roy Carr, he's never heard this story before. In fact, most people haven't heard this story before. They think of Phil Spector as the producer that put out the Let It Be album. But in that interview, Phil Spector says, no, I was with them since day one, and I was working with them and making them who they are. So he says to Roy Carr, when they landed in America on February 7th of 1964, was I not on the plane with them? And so the interviewer, Roy Carr, is, he's pausing and he's thinking, yes, you were. And so Phil was like, there you go. So Phil says he was involved in all of the albums going back from the beginning. I think he rattled off Rubber Soul, Sgt. Pepper. So what does that mean? Phil Spector's de facto house band was the Wrecking Crew out of L.A. Now, the Wrecking Crew, they were responsible for the musicianship and the instrumentation on many, 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 many pop songs in the 1960s and the 1970s. The Wrecking Crew worked with the Beach Boys. They worked with Frank Sinatra, Tom Jones, Nancy Sinatra, and the list goes on and on and on.
Hitters, yeah.
They were the go-to studio musicians when you were going to go put an album out. So what Phil is telling us in so many words is that the Wrecking Crew, in all likelihood, based upon that interview with Roy Carr, they were the musicians on some of those Beatle tracks. I'm not going to say all of them because there were studio musicians out in the UK as well, just like the Wrecking Crew that, and I'll give you some of those names too. The other thing is that Phil Spector used to refer to studio drummer Jim Keltner, and Jim Keltner has done a lot of playing with Ringo Starr, George Harrison. He used to refer to him as Ringo. What we can draw from that, if we want to start connecting dots, is that Jim Keltner was likely another drummer on Beatles songs.
Yeah.
So now we've got Andy White, Bernard Purdy, Ronnie Verrill, Jim Keltner, and if the Wrecking Crew was involved on recording some of the Beatles' music, in all likelihood, we could probably throw Hal Blaine into the equation as well, because Hal was the famous drummer from the Wrecking Crew. Then we have an interview, not an interview, but it was Glenn Campbell was introducing, I should say, Cream on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. So Glenn was the guest host that night. So Cream was going to play. Glenn got up on stage, and this is July of 1968. And Glenn Campbell, by the way, played for the Wrecking Crew. It's likely that Glenn is also on Beatle tracks. But when he introduced Cream, which would be Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, and Jack Bruce, the bass player, he said that they were cream of the crop studio musicians out of the UK. And then Glenn goes on to say that they have played on Beatle records, the Rolling Stones, and he rattles off a couple of other bands. Very eye-opening. I don't know how many people caught it, but Glenn Campbell said on national TV that the members of Cream, being studio musicians, played on Beatle records.
Wow.
Now, some people will argue with me and say, well, that he means that Eric Clapton played lead guitar on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I said, no, that's not what he's saying. George Harrison didn't ask Eric Clapton to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps until September of 1968. Glenn introduced Cream in July of 1968. So Glenn was referring to each member of Cream playing on Beatle records. I know a guy that was a very, very close friend to Dan Peake. Now, Dan Peake is one of the founding members of the band America. And America was produced by George Martin. This person wrote me, and we have a correspondence every once in a while. And he said to me, Mike, I knew Dan very, very well. And he said to me, I remember him telling me that Jimmy Page played the lead guitar on I Saw Her Standing There, which is a song that's off the Beatles' first UK album, Please Please Me. Other candidates to have played on Beatle records, one is Vic Flick. So Vic Flick was the great studio guitarist out of the UK, out of England. And he is the person that played the James Bond sounding theme at the beginning of the Help track on the Help album in America. They don't have that same intro on the UK A Hard Day's Night album. But in the United States, when it was released, they had that James Bond sounding riff. That was Vic Flick. So Vic also played the guitar. He did the guitar work on the song Ringo's theme for the soundtrack. Now, my thinking is, okay, look, if you're going to bring Vic Flick in, are you going to bring him in just to play those two things, those two parts? Or are you going to bring a guy like Vic Flick in to actually sit in and record a number of songs? The other thing is, get a load of this one, Michael. Vic Flick played for the George Martin Orchestra. Okay? So it's not like they didn't know who he was. If he played the George Martin Orchestra, then George Martin clearly knew who he was, and I'm sure they brought him in. Also, another candidate to have played on Beatles songs is Big Jim Sullivan. So Big Jim, out of the UK as well, he was a very sought-after studio player, and he was also a very adept sitar player. I'm thinking that it was Big Jim that was playing both recording the guitar work on Norwegian Wood and also the sitar work. The story goes that George Harrison, who we're told was learning the sitar, used to visit Big Jim Sullivan. So if he's going to visit Big Jim Sullivan, I'm thinking he was probably getting lessons from a guy that had mastered the instrument. But it's not George Harrison on Norwegian Wood. It's just not. It's got to be a guy like Big Jim Sullivan. I was also told by another source that another drummer that drummed on Beatles songs was Alan White. Now, Andy White is the drummer I spoke about earlier. Alan White is the drummer that used to play for Yes, the band Yes. And he also, I'm told, played on Beatle recordings. So those are some of the names that I have. I'm trying to think if there's any more. In an interview that John Lennon did, I think it was probably back in the 1970s. I watched it a long time ago. John had said that they had other musicians playing on their songs, but they weren't allowed to talk about it. Yeah, so in any case, I'm just taking the audience through this because those are some names. People always ask me, who do you think was on those albums? It's possible Eric Clapton was also playing on other Beatle songs other than While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I think Jimmy Page played on more than just I Saw Her Standing There. I think Vic Flick was on a lot of the songs. Big Jim Sullivan was on a lot of the songs. In the Red Bull interview in 2004 with Bernard Purdy, Bernard said that there were 4 drummers on the Beatles' early music, and he's talking about the period between 1962 and 1966. And he said, this is a direct quote, Ringo was not one of them. He said Ringo's job was to play live. Studio work, no. And
I believe all of this, by the way, because again, going back to, modern times, you look at an album and there's all kinds of people getting accredited for their work in the studio.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that it's no different than it was back in the day.
No. And the thing is, the Beatles recording sessions were sequestered. So there was a very, very limited number of people that were allowed to be in those recording sessions. It was pretty much closed door. And you have to ask yourself, well, on one hand, I could understand not having a crowd in there. But on the other hand, it also seems like it was a way in order to keep the story from leaking out, keeping the truth from leaking out.
Right. And hearing all this, I mean, I feel like Quincy Jones was right about them being the worst musicians in the world. And I feel like now, knowing what I know now hearing you talk about this, I feel like he's been vindicated here.
Well, what he was saying was that the Beatles were not studio players. That's what he was saying. Quincy being a big-time producer like George Martin. In fact, there's an interview with George Martin that Billy's the guy that's playing Paul McCartney, Billy Shears. It goes back to a documentary about George Martin. It's called Produced by George Martin. And Billy's sitting down with George, and Billy's saying, well, you were used to working with studio musicians. And they were having a conversation around Ringo. And so George Martin goes, yeah, that's what I work with, studio musicians. And then Billy goes on to say that Ringo had a tendency to speed up. In other words, his ability to stay in the pocket and keep time wasn't great.
Right. Yeah, again, and Jones also says that about Ringo Starr. saying that he remembers once we were in the studio with George Martin, Ringo had taken 3 hours for a 4 bar thing he was trying to fix on a song. And that's when he said he couldn't get it. He said to go get some shepherd's pie in a sarcastic tone.
Right.
I believe he said something like that in an interview with, who was it? The New Yorker, I believe it was.
That's right. He told Ringo to take a break because Ringo he could not get the drum part down. And so Quincy said, go get some shepherd's pie and a beer and take a break. And what happened was he got a hold of Ronnie Verrill. Ronnie, I talked about, his relative said that Ronnie played on Beatles tracks.
Right.
And Ronnie came in. And again, folks, this information is readily available. Just look up Quincy Jones and the Beatles. We're no playing MFers. It'll pop
Yeah,
up.
people were trying to say at the time, Quincy Jones is talking out of his backside. He doesn't know what he's talking about. It seems like he was right all along.
So when he came out with that story, what happened was the news and the Beatles enterprise went into damage control. You can't be saying that stuff, Quincy.
Yeah.
So then there were articles that came out afterwards and said that he had apologized. But the thing is, Quincy did not apologize for saying that the Beatles, and specifically he talked about Ringo and Paul McCartney. And he wasn't talking about Billy, because Billy's an accomplished musician. He was talking about the original Paul. When he apologized for airing his sentiments out in public. He never came back and said, oh, I'm really sorry for what I said because you know what? They can play. I was talking out of turn. I shouldn't have said that. That's not what he said. He said, I should not have said anything. My daughters got upset with me. I'm paraphrasing here because I aired out dirty laundry. It's interesting. There was an article also by another interview that was done in New Music Express with the Beatles' original sound engineer, Norman Smith. I think it was dated 1971. So this is only 9 years after the Beatles got going with EMI and recording. And during that interview, Norman Smith said that he wasn't impressed with them, that they had a very difficult time getting Love Me Do down. And I'm going by memory here. I believe he said that they failed in the studio. And this is Norman Smith. This was their sound engineer. So the point being is, Michael, that there's a lot of information out there. You have to find this stuff. It's there. And when you find it, you start to put the pieces together, and it tells an entirely different story about the Beatles. It's 180 degrees opposite of what we're told from a Beatles official narrative, the Cinderella story.
Right. It's not so organic after all.
No, it's not organic. We have to understand that the music business is a business, and they're putting a product out.
Right.
And to put that product out, they have to do it as cost effectively and as efficiently as they possibly can. So they're not going to, when I say they, the producers and the record label, not going to spend any time at all working with people that are going to cost them money. In other words, they're not up to the skill level of a studio musician.
Right. And for those who don't know, going into a studio costs a lot of money, by the way.
Yeah. And some people want to argue, oh, the Beatles had free studio time. There's no such thing as free studio time.
That doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. You still have to pay people to be there.
Right.
You have to keep the lights on. You have to have sound engineers, sound techs. You have to pay the producer,
Yeah, there's a lot of people got to get their cut.
Yeah.
In other words, folks, it's not just you go in the studio and you have all this time. It doesn't work that way.
No. And with Rubber Soul, what happened was, the story goes that the Beatles came into the Rubber Soul sessions and they banged out 16 songs. And they came in with virtually no backlog of music. So that's what piqued my interest, because I was watching a DVD. It's Deconstructing the Beatles. And Scott Fryman is the author of the DVD series. And Scott does a great job. He tells the official narrative, but, Scott's an accomplished composer himself, and he does a great job of presenting the story. But as a musician myself and as a songwriter, I got 15 or 20 minutes into that DVD when he got to the point where he said they came in essentially empty. They had no songs written, and they had to get 16 done in 30 days, 14 for the album and 2 for a single. I said, that didn't happen. Did not happen, because
that's kind of hard to do.
It's impossible to do. You have to write the music. You then have to learn the music. When I say learn, let's say Paul writes a song or John writes a song. Then he's got to take it to the other band members and teach
And
them
teach them.
and teach
Yeah.
them. And then once you are taught the song, then you go through rehearsals. And as you're going through the rehearsal, you're going to make changes to the songs because you're going to think, okay, I thought that was going to work, but it's not working.
Yeah,
It's
it
not,
doesn't sound that good.
doesn't sound right, so we have to do something different.
So
And
it does take a lot of time to arrange music is essentially what Mike is saying here, folks. And
yes,
that's
yes,
100% true. If you ever played in a band, and I have, I know exactly how and what goes on. And doing something to that extent, producing in any kind of album, even an EP for that matter, off the top of your head, is pretty impossible.
I'm glad I'm talking to somebody that has that experience. You also have to write the lyrics. And sometimes lyrics will come quickly. Other times lyrics do not come quickly. So
And we're talking about the Beatles here, by the way, folks.
right. You've got two work streams. You've got the music piece of it and you have the lyric piece of it. And then you've got to bring them together. And the way it works is sometimes the music comes first. Other times you have the lyrics.
Right.
So there's this give and take and there's this dynamic. So when you think about coming into the studio with no music and you're going to start writing the songs when you arrive and you've got to finish everything up in 30 days, which means write, learn, rehearse, arrange, record, and mix 16 songs, that's not happening. I'm
It's
sorry.
not. And by the way, you also forget the fact that when you are in a band, let's say the drummer doesn't like a riff or the guitar player doesn't like a drum fill that you did. I mean, it goes on and on. So to do that in such a little time, that sounds impossible to me right away, by the way.
It's really not possible. And especially there was an interview that John and Paul did back on August 5th of 1966. It was the same day that they released Revolver. That's the album after Rubber Soul. And during that interview, it's a BBC interview, the BBC interviewer is asking them, various questions about songwriting and all this stuff. And John and Paul said, well, with the last album, and he's talking about Revolver because that's the album that was just released on that day. He said it took us weeks to write just one song. Weeks. So I'm listening to this interview, and I actually have put this interview, I slipped it into different presentations to get the point across. If it took you weeks to write one song for Revolver, then how did you write 16 songs in 30 days? That's 4 weeks. How did you do that?
The math ain't adding up. It ain't adding up.
The math is not adding up. And I have people who want to argue with me and say, oh, no, they came in with some songs. Well, in Mark Lewison's book, one of his books, I have it behind me, I have two of his books. He said that the Beatles had to write more than a dozen songs in a 30-day period of time. So for all the people that want to push back, I said, okay, let's go with Mark Lewison's explanation. Mark is considered the Beatles historian. And Mark is telling us that they had to write 13 or more songs when they went into the Rubber Soul sessions. So I said, let's just go with that. Let's just go with 13 songs. So the Beatles arrive at EMI Studios on October 11th of 1965. Again, they don't have any songs. So the official narrative says they had partial drafts of Michelle, We Can Work It Out, What Goes On. The official narrative will say, well, they brought What Goes On from an earlier time. I think it goes back to 1962 or something. They brought it into the Rubber Soul sessions. But what they don't tell you, unless you dig deep, is that the entire song was revamped. So in other words, it was completely rewritten. Essentially what they did was they tossed the old version of the song and they had to rewrite it, keeping the chorus and trashing everything else. So what happened was they arrive on October 11th. On October 12th, Michael, the song Run for Your Life is done. So you show up on the 11th, and then on the very next day, you've got the first song in the bag. Then on October 13th, 2 days after they arrive, Drive My Car is done. Day Tripper on the 16th, 5 days in. If I Needed Someone, 7 days in. Then we have Norwegian Wood, 10 days in. In My Life and Nowhere Man are completed on the same day, on October 22nd. And then We Can Work It Out on October 29th. So In October alone, 8 songs were recorded in 18 days with a total of 28 takes for all songs, which is an average of 3.5 takes per song. So the thing with Rubber Soul that they tell us is that not one song exceeded 5 takes. You didn't come in with anything. You had to write, learn, rehearse, record, and not one song took more than 5 takes. And then we have the same type of thing happening in November. In fact, in November, it gets even weirder because on November 11th, we're told that the Beatles completed 4 songs on the very last day. They were recording Rubber Soul between October 11th and November 11th of 1965. So on the very last day, in a very long session, I think it was like 12 or 13 hours, they banged out You Won't See Me and Girl, 2 songs that didn't exist before that day. They finished off Wait, which they pulled in from the Help recording sessions from earlier in the year, in the spring. And they did I'm Looking Through You. So the question we have to ask ourselves is that even remotely realistic?
Sounds like a stretch.
It's a huge stretch. So in November, they did 8 songs. They were recorded in 13 days, which was 5 days less than October, with a total of 14 takes, half the number of takes, which averages 1.8 or 2 takes per song. It's ludicrous. This is the type of thing that I was taking a look at and I was analyzing it. And I had to dot my I's, cross my T's. I had to double check. I had multiple sources to make sure that the dates were right, that the number of takes was correct, because you don't want to make a fool out of yourself when you're doing this work.
Right.
So that's why Rubber Soul is what I refer to as the silver bullet. It's the silver bullet that says that the Beatles did not write all their own music and did not play on all of their recorded tracks. Also, in that August 5th, 1966 interview, Paul said that we're limited as a group and we're the first to say we're not all that good musically. He said the same thing 2 months earlier at the Japan Hilton, where he said that they never claimed to be great musicians. Now, here's the problem with that statement. This is coming from the horse's mouth. This is coming from Biological Paul. In order for you to pull off the schedule I just took everybody through, getting all those songs done in October and November, from October 11th through November 11th, you have to be really good musically, very skilled at your instrument.
Yeah, you can't half-ass it, in other words.
Right, because you're banging this stuff out. So what happened was, this is what happened with Rubber Soul. I'll just cut to the chase. All of the songs were pre-written. All of the songs were pre-recorded instrumentally. So George Martin had the songs written, brought in the studio guys and gals, banged out the music, and then when the Beatles showed up in the studio on October 11th, their job was to sing the vocals.
There you go, yes.
They had to learn the vocals. So I'm sure what happened was when the tracks came in, there was a guide vocal so that they could learn the melody.
Yeah, the melody, the chorus.
Harmonies,
right.
Right. That's what their job was for 30 days. That's what they had to do for 16
That
songs.
sounds more believable, more logical, in my opinion.
That's definitely what happened. And that's the model, Michael, that was being used from day one. So that's just not Rubber Soul. So if we go back to Please Please Me, all the way through Revolver. Here's a little tidbit of information about Revolver. So Revolver was their 7th album. And right after they released Revolver, they went on tour. And their set lists did not include one song off their newly released Revolver album. Not one.
Not one, huh?
Not one. Why was that? The reason for that is because they hadn't learned the songs. They weren't taught how to play the songs. So,
well, that makes sense too, right there, yes.
Right, when the Beatles went on tour, and their set lists were usually 30 minutes and around 11 songs. And many times, 2 of those 11 songs were covers. So the Beatles spent time at EMI Studios being tutored on how to play these songs. And then they would rehearse those songs. And those are the songs that they took out on the road. There's also an article that came out. Let me see if I could find it real quick. It was in an official Beatles magazine that was out during the day. I think it was Beatles Monthly or something like that. And so Paul McCartney was asked the question, we're talking about Biological Paul, what do they have in the hopper for songs going into their next recording session? And they were referring to Rubber Soul. And Paul said, we don't have anything. The cupboard's bare. So here we have it again from the horse's mouth, from Paul McCartney, saying that, we're going into the studio. We don't have anything really written. So we're going to go in cold. Now, the other problem with this coming into Rubber Soul with no music is we're told that with all of the touring and all of the publicity and everything else the Beatles were doing, going back, starting in late 1962, up through when they had to show up in the studio to do Rubber Soul on October 11th, apparently, according to the official narrative, they always found time to write music. We're told that they allegedly wrote 8 songs, original songs for their first album, Please Please Me, 8 songs for their second album with the Beatles, all 13 songs for A Hard Day's Night, even though the recordings sessions for A Hard Day's Night overlapped with the timeline for the making of the movie. So, go figure that. 8 more songs for their next album, which was Beatles for Sale. And then we get into Help, and they were able to bang out 12 original songs. So the official narrative is telling us that they found time to do this, even though their schedule was extremely hectic, and it was very, very hectic. They still found time, John and Paul, because they were prolific, genius songwriters, to get these songs written for these albums. Well, the question then becomes, what happened after their 5th album, Help? Did they just stop writing songs? Did they not know that they had a record that they had to record later in the year in 1965? Because in 65, the first album in 65 that they put out was Help. The second one was Rubber Soul. The Beatles were on the hook for 2 albums a year. And that's a lot of work. That's a lot of sitting down and doing songwriting and banging through music and lyrics and putting your heads together and pulling songs together.
Indeed.
So they were on the hook for that. The point I'm making to the audience is Rubber Soul was not a surprise. In other words, they knew they had a second album they had to do later in the year after Help. Did everybody just nod off and fall asleep and just forget about writing songs for the upcoming album? Brian Epstein never reached out to the band that he was managing and said, hey, lads, how are we doing? How are you coming along with those songs? George Martin says we need 16, 14 for the album and 2 for a single. So I hope you guys are heads down doing this. And then we're to believe that George Martin himself, the producer, didn't contact Brian Epstein or didn't reach out to the Beatles themselves and ask, how are we coming along with the songs?
Right.
That's an enigma. Now, the other thing, too, is no producer, no record label, no producer is going to be on a hook to get an album out and not have any songs written when the band enters the studio. Because what will happen when the band cannot write 16 songs? What's going to happen? EMI is going to what? They're going to say, oh, that's okay. Don't worry about it.
Right.
But we'll catch you, the next time. No. I mean, there would be hell to catch for not getting that album out because the Beatles were a huge cash flow to EMI. And Rubber Soul was positioned for the Christmas season. And that record had to be in retail by December 3rd of 1965 in order for EMI to really capitalize on the Christmas buying season.
Right. There are certain deadlines you must meet.
Right. There's absolutely no way, when you put your thinking cap on, you think logically, there is no way George Martin or EMI was going to accept that the Beatles were going to come in with virtually no material and then throw a Hail Mary and pray to God that they were going to pull it off.
And they have a hit, in other words, too.
Right, right. And the thing, too, is when you take a look at Rubber Soul, there's really no filler. We're talking about some really good songs. I mean, you might say that some of the songs like Run for Your Life is not the best thing they've ever put out, but
right.
There's other great songs on there like Drive My Car, Day Tripper, If I Needed Someone, Norwegian Wood, In My Life, Nowhere Man, We Can Work It Out, Michelle. I mean,
yeah, I have a hard time believing Day Tripper took like an hour to make.
Right. It's absolutely just a ridiculous story. And so what happens is when you see the little thread and when you start pulling at it, the sweater comes apart, the sleeves fall off.
True.
And it's interesting, since I've done this,
wow,
I've never had anybody who means anything write me and say, here's how it was done.
You face no pushback then in terms of the technical aspects of
No,
the writing and all that sort of jazz.
no. What I get is
Yeah.
I get avoidance. They don't even bring it up. They don't go there. Of course,
They don't say, "Oh, Mike." They don't say, "Oh, Mike, you're just jealous." They're better writers than you, better musicians than you.
oh,
Mike, all this time you're just jealous.
I'll get that from the people who don't matter. In other words,
All right. I mean,
if
yeah.
somebody's a layperson, they're not a songwriter, they're not a musician, they've never been in a recording studio, if they've never done any of that work, they will throw those types of statements out there. Nonsense.
Those are just the marks. Yes.
Yes, those are the marks. But
Right.
people within the industry, no, they know. They zip up. Although, like I said, there are people that are in the industry that reached out to me and said, you're right.
It's another question I was going to briefly ask you, by the way. I was curious if anybody from the biz have reached out to you and have basically vindicated some of your thoughts and opinions and some of your work, in other words.
Yes, I can't give their names out because,
As I know, you
yeah,
can do that.
the reason
Gotta
why
protect
is
them.
because to talk about this and you're in the business, you run the risk of being blackballed. This is sacred territory. Some of these folks have become friends of mine. One is a sound engineer out of Europe. He's worked with some big bands. He's helped me a lot to understand a lot of how this works behind the scenes. One person is very accomplished in the music industry and has been in the industry for a long time.
Who, Rick Rubin? Just
No,
kidding.
it's not Rick. There is an interesting story about Rick Rubin, though, in that,
Oh, really?
well, in that Hulu special, McCartney 321.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know if people have watched that, but if you hadn't, watch this piece of it at least. So what happens is, Rick's interviewing Billy, Paul McCartney,
Right.
and
I remember now.
right, and he brings up the tracks for While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And so Rick isolates the bass track and he's playing it back. And as Billy's listening to it, Billy seems to be as much in awe of the bass sound and the tone and the aggressiveness as Rick. And I'm watching this, I'm thinking to myself, this is very interesting. Billy didn't add anything to the conversation. Things like, hey, Rick, you know how I got that sound? I played through this amp. This is the bass I played. I played a Rickenbacker. I played whatever. I played a Fender.
Yeah.
No information like that, Michael. None.
Really?
No. He was just kind of going along with Rick, playing along, and it was obvious to me Billy did not play the bass on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, because if he had, he would have had all kinds of information that he would have sprinkled onto the conversation with Rick Rubin in order to explain how it came about.
You're right about that, because if you do something of that magnitude, small little details of what you were doing.
Of course.
What your finger was in this position, actually, but you played it this way instead. Yeah, you would know these sort of things.
Yes. And if somebody said to me, Mike, how did you get that guitar sound on your song, the tone, what amp did you play through? How did you get that sound? I would say, okay,
Right.
This is what I did. I found that to be very interesting.
That's telling. No, you're right.
It is very telling. So who do I think played bass on While My Guitar Gently Weeps? I think it was Jack Bruce from Cream, because remember, Eric Clapton from Cream played the lead guitar. So I'm thinking maybe it was Jack Bruce that came in and laid down the bass track for While My Guitar Gently Weeps, because Billy added absolutely no insights. Zero.
Right, yeah. That's a dead giveaway, in my opinion.
The article I was talking about was the Beatles book before. I said the Beatles magazine. Here's another interesting blurb out of that book. It's dated October of 65, so it was right before the Beatles went in for Rubber Soul. So it talks about Brian Epstein's plan to film the Beatles' performance at Shea Stadium in America. Then it goes on to say that some of the sounds were not quite right, and the boys have to dub their voices in bits where the screaming prevented the vocal from being recorded. Let me explain why that's important. What this official magazine, the Beatles book, is telling us is that the version of the Beatles Shea Stadium performance that you listen to on YouTube was edited and enhanced post-production. So what this is telling us is the vocals were redone in the studio after the fact. It's also telling us that if they had to redo the vocals because of bleed from the audience and the screaming, that means anything else that was being mic'd, like the guitar amps, the bass amp, and the drums, also had to have had the same exact problem.
Right.
That would mean that not only were the vocals redone after the fact, but also the music.
Yeah, everything was overdubbed.
Everything was overdubbed
Damn.
in the studio after the fact. And then what they did was they synced up the performance with the new recordings. And that's what they released. And
Yeah, that's a 1-2 punch right there.
yeah, it's very clear what happened there. And the use of backing tracks. In fact, I had a listener of mine analyze two backing tracks from the Beatles' 1966 performance. I think it was Candlestick Park and Dodger Stadium. And Michael, I forgot which song it was, a song or two. They were exact replicas. In other words, there was no difference in the performance, none whatsoever, which means they had a backing track, a pre-recorded track, and that's what they laid in. That's what they put in, inserted as part of the performance. And the use of backing tracks, by the way, is very, very common. I mean, this has come out a lot now.
It's still going on to this very day.
Yep, it's coming out a lot now. Even the use of vocals are being reused where there's miming on stage. The singer is miming. Phil from the YouTube channel Wings of Pegasus does an awful lot of work on this, does some great work on it. And he has shown where so many performances, they're using pre-recorded vocal tracks over and over and over again. And there's actual miming taking place on stage. In fact, a big surprise was when it came out that Don Henley was doing it from the Eagles.
And by the way, we didn't really even gloss over the fact that some of these songs, it seems like there was some influencing or borrowing of other artists out there during that time as well. Which is what you get from a lot of bands out there, including Metallica, for instance. Another good example, much more modern example of these people stealing riffs from other smaller bands, lesser known.
Yeah, there's a lot of what they call borrowing. Let me just take a look here. I think I have something here on some of the songs that the Beatles borrowed. Bear with me 1 second, folks. Okay. So this was an article.
You see, Mike, if you only had produced if you had produced a book, Mike, it wouldn't take you this long to find it.
I know. 5 songs the Beatles ripped off. This is from Rolling Stone magazine. Goes back a ways. So the beginning of Revolution comes from Pee Wee Creighton's Do Unto Others. Come Together was borrowed or pinched from Chuck Berry's You Can't Catch Me. Lennon was sued in 1973 by Chuck Berry's publisher because Come Together borrows from Chuck Berry's You Can't Catch Me. I Feel Fine was borrowed from Bobby Parker's Watch Your Step. I Saw Her Standing There was from Chuck Berry's I'm Talking About You. The bass line is identical. And Lady Madonna was from Humphrey Littleton's Bad Penny Blues.
Yeah, George Harrison. Also, his song, My Sweet Lord.
Yeah, he ripped off the Chiffons, He's So Fine. I mean, and he ripped it off. It's funny, John Lennon was asked about it in the Playboy interview in 1980. You know, what do you think about George Harrison and the lawsuit because My Sweet Lord was plagiarizing He's So Fine? And I'll never forget this. I'll paraphrase this now because it's been a long time, but John said he knew better.
He knew better, yeah.
He knew better. So, that was John's way of saying, yeah, he knew he ripped it off. Boy, I can go on and on, Michael. There's just so much of this stuff.
I appreciate your insights here. Believe me, I really do. It's been wild listening to this, and again, it vindicates a lot of things that have been said in the past. A lot of naysayers out there, a lot of the marks, very angry with this sort of thing. But to shift gears just here for a moment, you were saying the biological Paul McCartney. And I just wanted to get into that just for a few moments here. And of course, the theory goes that on, I believe, November 9th of 1966, Paul McCartney was tragically killed in a car crash on his way home from working on, I believe, the Sgt. Pepper album, correct?
The story goes, at least from the standpoint of the memoirs of Billy Shears, that he was getting song assignments from Brian Epstein. Okay. And then when Epstein gave him the song assignments, which is, I have said that it's a nonsense story because he wasn't writing anything. But in any case, Paul bolted out of the studio because he was annoyed at how many songs he had to write. But I guess it didn't bother them when they had to write 16 for, in 30 days for Rubber Soul. But anyway, he got in the car and it was a rainy day and he was driving down the highway. He actually picked up a hitchhiker along the way. We're told in memoirs her name was Donna. And it was soon after that he had an accident. That's the prevailing story around Paul is dead, that it was a car crash. He died in a car crash. But it's also possible that it was a ritual sacrifice. The book refers to it as death for success. I think in terms of like the 27 Club.
Yeah.
So
a lot of mysterious deaths happen, as we know.
Well, we can go through a list of all of the members of the 27 Club. Of course, Paul was 20, so he was 24.
24, yeah.
24 in 1966. But, we have Keith Moon of The Who. We have Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. We've got Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, John Bonham from Led Zeppelin. We can argue that all of these people died before their time. They died young. And
Very young.
And not all of them in the 27 Club. Whenever I go through this, somebody inevitably, a Zeppelin fan, will always say, John Bonham didn't die at 27. I said, I know. I'm just telling you that these people died before their time. I'm just rattling off some names.
And of course, Morrison, as you know, obviously.
Jim Morrison. There's so many of them. So many
There's
of them.
a lot.
There's a lot.
Yeah. And by the way, do you have any compelling, maybe forensic or behavioral proofs presented that support a post-1966 replacement?
The proof is that Billy is not Paul McCartney. He's not an identical match. He's not a spitting image of Paul McCartney. And all one needs to do, if they just sit back a little bit and analyze the images over time, you'll see that once we hit 1967 and the release of Sgt. Pepper, we have a different person. In fact, there's a lot of people on my channel, they're older folks like me, and they will write in the comment section or email me and say, Mike, when Sgt. Pepper came out, I remember looking at the cover and looking at this guy that we're told was Paul McCartney and thinking, that's not Paul McCartney. Some people picked it up right away. What happens, Michael, is if you don't line the images up next to each other over time, then you're not going to see the differences.
Yeah. You won't notice, in other words.
You won't notice. What happens is you're presented with images of Paul McCartney in 1967, and then you see images of Paul McCartney in 1968, or going back to 64 or 65. They're not being laid up against other images of Paul. So you're just taking it at that moment in time, that particular image, and you're told that's Paul McCartney. So you're like, okay, well, that's Paul McCartney.
Yeah, you believe it.
And the thing what they did with the Sgt. Pepper album, with Pepper, they changed the appearance of all of the Beatles. So we had the 62 through 66 period, and we had the mop tops, right?
Right.
Then when you get to Sgt. Pepper, now we have this psychedelic album. We have the Beatles now have a completely different look. Mustaches.
Yeah, after they're in India, dropping acid, all that sort of deal.
We have completely different look, completely different. And the reason why they did that was so that all of the members of the Beatles, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, they all look different. So when you're looking at that, you're thinking, well, wow, the whole band changed. Now, if they didn't change John, George, and Ringo, and they just brought Billy in on the cover of Sgt. Pepper, a lot more people probably would have said, who is that? But because they camouflage it with this album cover that just radiates a psychedelic feel to it, the Beatles look completely different. Many people just accepted the fact that, hey, that's Paul McCartney. Because if it's not him, then who is it? It's got to be him. And the other thing that the controllers did, when I talk about the controllers, I'm talking about Tavistock and all of their buddies. They went off and created a composite Paul McCartney. So as time went on, his appearance would alter. And so then what happens is it just becomes a big blur to the fan, to the person that's following the Beatles. And even somebody who doesn't follow the Beatles, it just becomes a big blur. And
that's true, especially if you don't have that in mind, especially, you're not really looking for these things.
Yeah. I mean, the best thing to do, if you want to do a quick comparison, it's one of the charts that I have. I can't show it here, but is go take a look at Paul McCartney in 1964 or 65. And then go take a look at Billy with his mullet in 1975 when he's with Wings. Stare at that picture. You should be walking away thinking to yourself and saying to yourself, that is not the same guy. And the reason is because he's not the same guy. And if you think he's the same guy, then I'm hoping you're never a witness to some kind of crime.
Right.
Okay.
Good point.
So that's what they did. There's a lot of sleight of hand. They have been doctoring images going back from the very beginning. I've noticed images have been doctored over the last 20 to 30 years. We have images where biological Paul's face is blended with Billy's face.
Mm.
In fact, there's one image in particular that goes back to Hamburg, and we're told that's Paul McCartney when he was in Hamburg. I'm like, that is not Paul McCartney in Hamburg. That's a hybrid of Paul and Billy.
And by the way, before I forget, what about his voice? Did that change, alter in any way?
Billy and Paul have different voices. We have to put it into context. Billy has been playing Paul McCartney since 1966, which means he's been at it for 60 years. So when people hear him speak, when people hear him sing or listen to the songs, that's who people know as Paul McCartney. But if you go back and you listen to the early Beatles songs and listen to Paul sing, as an example, Michelle or Yesterday, and then go listen to Billy, it's a different voice. Now, Billy does a very good job of mimicking Paul's voice. I'll give him that, a very good job. But a good test would be listen to the original Yesterday, going back to the Bio-Paul period, and then go get Billy's album, Give My Regards to Broad Street. I think that's the album, where he does a couple of Beatle covers, and Yesterday is one of those songs. And when you put the songs side by side and you listen to them, you can tell that they're different singers. You can also pick up, if you listen very closely, just pay attention, Billy's pronunciation and diction is different than Paul's. It's a different voice, even though I said he does a great job of mimicking.
Mimicking him, right, okay.
Yeah, he does a very good job of it. Now, there was a professor at the University of Miami going back into the 1960s. His name was Dr. Henry Truby. And Dr. Truby was an expert in linguistics and also in sonograms. So sonograms are voice prints. And he took a look at comparing the song Yesterday, the original Yesterday that Paul McCartney sings on, with Hey Jude, and I believe the other song was Penny Lane. He was fully expecting that there was going to be a match. Obviously, Dr. Truby didn't think that they swapped the guy out. Once he got done with his analysis, he came out and said there's a very high likelihood that the person that's singing the song Yesterday is not the same vocalist on Hey Jude and Penny Lane.
Interesting.
Now, some people will say that, and Phil, if you're listening to this, I'm not picking on you, buddy. I love your channel. I was mentioned Phil from Wings of Pegasus. Now,
right. Phil
does these analysis based upon pitch analysis. And this would be auto-tune and pitch correction. And I think he analyzed, maybe it was yesterday. I think it was yesterday. It's going back a while. And he said because of a certain inflection or a certain note or phrase, because it looked similar from song to song, that it proved that it was the same person, that Paul McCartney's always been Paul McCartney. And so what I have been trying to explain to people is that pitch correction technology is not the same thing as biometric voice analysis of voice prints, or what used to be referred to as sonograms.
Right. Yeah, it's a little different.
It's very different. Pitch correction technology, the purpose of it is to modify a singer or a speaker's voice to correct off-key or out-of-tune notes. Right? And that's primarily for improving musical or audio quality. But it's not used, and it cannot be used, for identification. Biometric voice analysis, on the other hand, identifies or authenticates individuals based upon unique vocal characteristics, or analyzes voice patterns for insights into identity, emotion, or health. So it examines vocal traits like pitch, tone, cadence, format, frequencies, and speech patterns to create a unique voice print or derive biometric data. So without getting too much more into this, when you call a financial institution or a bank, or maybe even your benefits provider, your health benefits, many times they will recognize you based upon your voice.
Your unique sonic signature of the voice.
Right. So your voice is very much like your fingerprints. It's unique to each individual.
Right.
So when they go about identification, let's say a financial institution like a bank, they're not using pitch analysis. Pitch analysis analyzes the gap between the note that was sung and the target note. So if you sing a note a little flat or a little sharp, the pitch technology can correct that. It could move the slightly sharp or slightly flat note to pitch. But that's not identification. If biological Paul was still alive and he had a bank account with a financial institution and Billy called up to get information about that bank account, and the process of identification was biometric voice analysis, Billy wouldn't pass it. He would be denied access to the account. Sometimes people will say, well, when Dr. Truby did his work back in 1968, that was old technology, that was this, that was that. But remember that Dr. Truby was an expert in his field of linguistics and sonograms. In fact, police departments use biometric voice analysis or voice prints to help them solve crimes, not pitch analysis. There's so much to this, Michael.
There's a lot. I know. I mean, it's crazy that it goes this deep. And again, that's more revealing to me than other things I've heard, other theories. And that makes a lot of sense to me. You know, you're speaking a lot of sense here, Mike.
Well, it's been 8 years of looking into it. And what happens, Michael, is when you're doing it for so long, you get a lot of questions. You know, people ask a lot of questions. Right. And a lot of questions are great questions. I'm like, that's a good question. Let me go take a look at that. But the ones where people are pushing the right buttons and asking the right questions, that would set me off to go take a look at, what about that? What about that?
Makes me want to dig deeper. Absolutely. And as we go along here, another thing I wanted to quickly mention were over the years, you had Paul McCartney appearing on the Howard Stern show. Have you checked out any of those interviews? And what did you make of any of those?
The one I watched recently, though, it's funny you should bring this up. I watched it about 2 weeks ago. And Howard was asking Paul McCartney, Billy, if John was gay. And, there was always this rumor that was swirling around that he had an affair with Brian Epstein.
Oh, my.
Yeah, that's been around for a long time. And what's interesting enough is that Billy kind of answered the question in a weird way. We were good buds and good mates, and I never got the sense that John had a homosexual aspect to his sexuality. Billy was being coy about it. That's how I felt when I was watching the interview. So in other words, he really didn't want to answer it. And by not answering directly, then what happens? The person that's watching this is thinking, well, maybe then he was gay. By the way, I remember Ginger Baker being one of those musicians that said something. And of course, again, Ginger was he was the drummer for Cream. And, right. And possibly another one of the drummers that drummed on Beatles songs. It was an article called Artists Who Zing the Beatles. We had the great jazz musician, Charles Mingus. Charles is considered one of the greatest jazz musicians of all time. Unfortunately for him, the mainstream popularity of jazz was in steep decline at the same time as the Beatles were shooting to fame. As a super talented black artist whose commercial appeal was limited by both his musical genre and his race, it would be easy to become cynical about young white guys taking black musical forms and selling them back to mainstream America. So in the early 70s, Mingus unleashed an epic rant about the Beatles and their assimilation of black American sounds. He took things further by suggesting that the Beatles didn't even write their own songs, instead being controlled by some sort of consortium of UK pop masterminds. Now folks, this is not me. This is Charles Mingus, who's considered one of the greatest jazz musicians of all time. He says they stole what we call rock, studied it. He goes, not the Beatles, but the great classical minds from England, and they built the Beatles, and the Beatles were a machine. And they promised these kids so much money, and they trained them. They were not musicians when they came. And this is exactly what I was saying before.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, Michael, because I didn't find this article until a number of years after I came out with my presentation back in April of 2020. Did the Beatles write all their own music? So it goes back to what I said before. The information is out there, but you just have to dig and dig and dig, and it'll pop up. And then if you find enough of these pieces, enough of these loose ends here and over there, and you start connecting the dots, then the story starts to come together. The alternative story starts to come together.
Right. Man, You've been on quite a journey, Mike.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, and I have to tell you, Michael, I'm glad that it's over.
I know it is exhausting, I'm sure. One last one in regards to Paul McCartney.
Yeah.
As you know, Michael Jackson purchased the publishing rights to the Beatles music catalog back in '85, I believe. What
Yes.
do you make of that, by the way? What is your analysis on that?
Bidding.
47.5 million.
Yes, and he was bidding with Billy. Billy wanted the rights as well. He wanted the publishing rights. And what Billy said was that it got to the point where it was so much money that he could no longer justify playing the game anymore. So Billy folded his cards. When Michael died, Sony had the publishing to the Beatles songs. There were articles in the newspaper and online where it said that Paul McCartney was suing Sony over the publishing because he wanted a piece of the action. I was told by somebody, and it goes back a number of years ago, and I can't say who these people are. Again, I'm going to have to protect the sources. Yeah.
Right.
Said that what happened was there were many of those songs from the early period that were not Billy's. The songs were credited to Lennon and McCartney. That doesn't mean that Paul McCartney and John Lennon wrote the songs. It goes back to what I said before. Right. Credits to songs can easily be applied based upon signing contracts. And it goes on all the time in the music industry. I was told that during that period of time, when Billy didn't have a piece of the action from the publishing from Sony, he didn't play many songs from the Bio-Paul period. He might play Yesterday or something like that, but it was basically a token number of songs. The reason why he did that was because he wasn't getting a cut of the publishing. So he went to Sony and said, look, I want a cut of the publishing, okay? Which means that the copyrights don't include him. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do.
It goes back to original Paul and to John Lennon.
Right.
So again, I'm just telling you what I was told. So he has this lawsuit with Sony, and what it's really about is I want a piece of the action of those old songs.
Right. He needs his cut.
And if you don't do it, then I'm not going to play them. And if I don't play them, you're going to be missing out on a lot of money because I'm going to press records from these concerts. I'm going to do DVDs. So eventually what happened was I was told that Sony finally said, okay, fine. Because Billy's attitude was, hey, this is a win-win for both of us. I get a piece of the action. I'll play the songs. Ka-ching, you get money. Ka-ching,
that's right.
I get money. But if you don't do it, I'm not going to touch it. So you're going to be missing out. You're going to have lost revenue because I'm not going to play them, and you're not going to see any revenue benefit from that. So that's an interesting story. Right. Again,
it is.
And let me just, again, tell the audience, I don't know if that's actually what went down. All I can tell you is that is what I was told.
He's been told, yeah.
It does make sense to me because back in the day when Billy was playing live, before that lawsuit, he wasn't playing a lot of the old songs. And then after the lawsuit, actually what happened was it never went to court. They settled out of court. And then all of a sudden, boom, he's doing all of these Beatles songs, the older Beatles songs.
That's very telling.
It's interesting. Like I said, I'll just throw that out there as just some food for thought for the audience.
It's a hypothesis, in other words.
Yeah, it's a story I was told. We'll just leave it like that.
A little birdie. Anyways, Mike, again, I do want to thank you for being generous with your time. Go ahead and plug anything you like, any final words. The floor is yours, my friend. Go ahead.
It's actually going to be quite quick. If you would like to follow my work, whether it be the Beatles or anything else, I have 2 blogs, one on Substack, one on Blogspot. Cover a lot of ground with a lot of different information, alternative news and research and stuff like that. Just go to my hub website. It's Sage of Quay, SAGEOFQUAY, sageofquay.com. All of my links are there. It's one-stop shop.
Very nice. Once again, thank you so much for your time, my friend. We will do this again. I hope we'll cover other things here aside from the Beatles, but thank you so much, Mike, for doing this, and I will see you on the other side.
Thank you, Michael.